The United Nations climate talks in Madrid have finally come to an end with a compromise deal. The conference endorsed a declaration on a quote-unquote urgent need to close the gap between existing emission pledges and temperature goals of the Paris Climate Agreement. With discussions that lasted over 12 days, 2 days extra, making it the longest but ultimately fruitless climate negotiation on record, the delegates reached a partial agreement on the key questions of increasing global response to curbing carbon. Now, the decision on how to regulate global carbon markets has been postponed until next year. The countries need to put new climate pledges on the table by the next conference in Glasgow.
Regretfully, after all the hard work that you have all done, we couldn't get to an agreement on this important article.
Despite all the efforts, it is my sincere regret that we were not able to reach an agreement on Article 6. Although gaps still remain, let me emphasize that market mechanisms are crucial instruments for raising ambition and promoting actions against climate emergency.
A push for higher ambition was supported by the EU and small island member nations. Other countries like the US, Brazil, India and China opposed the plan. The agreement included a new and improved carbon cutting plan, and it also called for addressing the gap between science and the current state of play. This year's round of annual UN talks focused on narrow technical issues like workings of global carbon markets, and this is where the concept of carbon credit comes in. Now let's take a look at how carbon credit works. Carbon credit is a tradable permit or a certificate that provides the holders the right to emit 1 ton of carbon dioxide, and it aims at reducing the emissions of greenhouse gases from industrial activities. Governments and regulatory authorities set the cap on greenhouse gas emissions. When the reduction of emissions is not economically viable, the companies can purchase additional carbon credits to comply with the emissions cap. Now, companies that achieve their goals are rewarded. This aims at reducing the effects of global warming. Economists consider carbon markets key in providing incentives for the world to move towards low-carbon growth models. This remained one of the major issues. Many countries from Europe and elsewhere said that no deal on how to govern the exchange of carbon credits was better than a weak one that could undermine existing regional carbon mechanisms. Meanwhile, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres expressed his disappointment after delegates failed to reach any deal. UN chief called it a missed opportunity to tackle the global warming crisis. He said, and I quote, "The international community has lost an important opportunity to show increased ambition on mitigation, adaptation and finance to tackle the climate crisis." Now, Benji Haya, our Wion correspondent, joins us live from London for more on this. So the longest but mostly fruitless climate negotiation, this is beyond disappointing, according to what Antonio Guterres says. Is it a lost opportunity?
Well, it is indeed disappointing, and this is after 2 weeks of debate and discussion in Madrid and a summit that was supposed to have actually taken place in Chile. 190 nations getting together to hammer home those details, but in the end, no new targets. And that's a real problem because on current expectations, the world is looking to warm by about 3 degrees by the end of the century. That could have some catastrophic effects for nations across the globe. Parts of Miami could be flooded, for example, or even much of the coastal area of Bangladesh, and so action is desperately needed. But the problem when it comes to these negotiations is that there's a number of different technicalities that just some of those major emitters couldn't agree on, the likes of the United States or China or Australia. And it meant that actually now the attention, as you say, goes to next year, the summit in Glasgow in November, where they'll hope to have some sort of breakthrough. The rhetoric or the lack of progress that came out of the talks in Madrid is a very stark contrast to the 500,000 or so protesters who took to the streets outside the building in the Spanish capital. and they were inspired by none other than 16-year-old schoolgirl Greta Thunberg, who instigated those climate strikes and called for action. But even she admits that actually all this movement, these protests, have achieved absolutely nothing in the grand scheme of things. There has been a 4% increase in greenhouse gas emissions since the Paris Accord in 2015. And what was agreed upon and celebrated a few years ago now seems like a very distant memory.
Yeah, a push for higher ambition was obviously supported by the EU and some small island member nations. But the other countries, like you mentioned, the big countries like US, China, Brazil, India among them, opposed to the plan. Now, looking at these countries who reverse to complying with these measures, how can we expect this playing out next year, considering the damaging carbon footprint from these big countries, big players?
It's going to come down, as I say, to those very small details, those technicalities, what you were mentioning actually just before in terms of the carbon credits that are all in Article 6. So it's a bit of a complicated language, but in effect, that's the stuff that is going to have to be focused on in order to make some sort of breakthrough. And it will take some degree of movement amongst those major emitters like the United States and China. Many of the other nations, I should say, agree on the vast majority of things. 90% of the Paris Accord has complete consensus. It's that kind of final 10% that needs agreement in Glasgow. Now, what they'll discuss exactly or whether a breakthrough will happen is still unknown. It was anticipated that we'd have some sort of constructive progress this time. And of course, it ended in disappointment. And so many other delegates are praying that next time there can be a degree of progress. And I think they'll be hoping that they can have more power themselves as well, because the way that this process works is that delegates are sent by their nations to represent them. But when it comes down to the big decisions, by saying, yes, we're going to commit to A, B and C, that can only be taken by those at the very top who weren't all present in Madrid and might not be present in Glasgow either.
Thank you for that report. That is Wion's correspondent Benji Haya coming to us live from London on the closure of the UN Climate Summit.